North America's supply chains were waiting on one decision: whether Washington would give Canada and Mexico a clean, long-term extension of the trade deal holding the continent together. Instead, the United States refused. The leader rejecting it had once sold the same pact as historic. Now, the grievance was deficits, and there is a number behind this rupture: 16 years, the renewal Canada and Mexico expected but did not get. By the end, you'll understand what blew up, why Canada is exposed, and how this fight reaches jobs, prices, and sovereignty. July 1st, Washington. That was the deadline, built into the USMCA review framework. Canada, Mexico, and the United States had to decide whether to extend the agreement for another 16 years. For Ottawa, a clean renewal would have meant stability. For factories, farms, rail corridors, energy contracts, and border towns, it would have meant one less political shock in a system already under strain. Donald Trump chose a different path. A senior administration official said Trump would not rubber stamp the agreement in its current form. Read that again. The deal does not disappear overnight. USMCA remains in force unless a member moves to withdraw. But without renewal, the agreement enters a cycle of annual reviews, creating pressure points that can reopen major parts of the pact through 2036. Washington's argument is that unresolved problems need leverage. Canada's warning is that leverage can become instability. And on July 1st, the signal was clear. Certainty was offered, and Washington refused it. To understand why this matters, rewind to Trump's first term. For years, he attacked NAFTA as a bad bargain for the United States. That criticism became one of the central promises of his trade agenda: tear up the old North American framework and replace it with something stronger. The result was USMCA. It took effect in July 2020, after Canada and Mexico negotiated under intense pressure from Washington. And at the time, Trump did not describe it as flawed. That is what makes the reversal so politically revealing. Washington's position is not that the agreement failed to exist, or that Canada refused to sign. The argument now is that the deal Trump himself sold as a victory still left the United States with trade deficits he considers unacceptable. Think about what that means. Canada, already negotiated, once under threat. Now Ottawa faces the same tactic in a new form: uncertainty as leverage. The deal changed. The pressure system did not. The smallest admission is also the most revealing. On the call announcing the decision, a senior administration official said Trump's primary concern with USMCA is the United States' trade deficits with Canada and Mexico. That matters because a deficit is not, by itself, proof that a trade agreement is broken. It can reflect energy flows, consumer demand, exchange rates, investment patterns, and the structure of integrated supply chains. Washington is right that deficits are politically sensitive, but treating them as the central failure of USMCA turns a continental production system into a scoreboard. Then came the sharper signal. In June, Trump said, "We don't need anything that Canada has." That is not the language of a stable partnership. It is the language of leverage. And for Canada, that distinction is not academic. It tells Ottawa that even a signed agreement can become conditional when Washington decides the numbers look wrong. The backdrop makes the pattern harder to dismiss. In his second term, Trump imposed broad tariffs on nearly every country, including Canada and Mexico. Parts of that tariff regime were later stymied by court losses. But the message had already been sent. Tariffs first, legal limits later, uncertainty throughout. And here is the mystery number: 16 years. That was the renewal prize, a 16-year extension that would have given businesses, workers, and governments a longer runway. Instead, the deal remains in place for up to another decade, but with annual reviews that can reopen major parts of the agreement until the 2036 sunset. Let that land for a second. The crisis is not one negotiation. It is uncertainty turned into policy. Maya is 38, a logistics manager at an auto parts supplier outside Windsor, and until this year, her future looked measurable. A shipment left Ontario, crossed the Ambassador Bridge, reached a customer in Michigan, and came back inside a production schedule that everyone understood. The rules were not perfect, but they were predictable enough to hire another dispatcher, price a contract, and justify new equipment. Now, the question is annual. That changes the room before a single tariff is added. A customer asks whether next year's parts will still qualify. A lender asks what happens if border rules shift again. A manager delays hiring because a signed contract no longer feels like a runway. It feels like a weather forecast. Washington can argue that reviews create leverage. That is true. They can pressure partners to fix weak points in the agreement. But for Maya, leverage becomes a cost line. It becomes postponed machinery, nervous buyers, and workers waiting for shifts that may never be posted. Then the circle widens. Truckers, farmers, steel and aluminum firms, grocery distributors, and small manufacturers do not reroute around the American market overnight. This is the Canadian fear. Not abstract politics, not theater, chaos. And the next question is who benefits when uncertainty becomes the business model. One 16-year renewal was on the table. Washington refused it. What replaced it was a treaty that survives for another decade, but with annual reviews capable of reopening major parts of the deal. That is, the math businesses now have to price. The American argument is not hard to understand, but trade deficit is politically powerful because it looks like a scoreboard. If the United States buys more from Canada or Mexico than it sells back, the phrase sounds simple. America is losing, and its partners are winning. For voters who have watched factories close, that argument lands fast. But bilateral deficits do not prove exploitation by themselves. They can reflect exchange rates, energy shipments, consumer demand, and integrated production lines where parts cross borders before the final product is counted. A Canadian input can help build an American export. Industry. The short version is this: a deficit is a measurement, not a verdict. And this is where the loop begins. Tariffs and threats are sold as tools to reduce the deficit, but they raise costs for firms that depend on cross-border inputs. Higher costs make contracts harder to price. Uncertainty slows investment. Slower investment weakens the very supply chains that made North America competitive. Then those weakened supply chains create fresh grievances, which justify more threats. Let that land for a second. The proposed cure can become part of the disease. For Canada, the lesson is not emotional, it is strategic. Diversifying trade does not mean betraying the United States. It means buying insurance against a partner willing to weaponize access to its own market. And once a country learns that lesson, the next question is not whether Canada can afford to diversify. It is whether Canada can afford not to. From Windsor and Oshawa to Hamilton, Calgary, Regina, Montreal, Halifax, and Vancouver, the pattern is the same. When Washington reopens the rules every year, Canadian planning gets harder. That is Maya's problem, and it is Canada's problem. The United States is entitled to protect its interests, but Canada is entitled to learn from the signal. Trump exposed his weakness by turning his own best agreement into a threat. Canada's answer is not panic. It is leverage, unity, and diversification. Market or move faster toward Europe, Asia, and domestic supply chains? Thank you for watching.